In the last video, we discussed the start of the Corinthian War. This conflict involved several of the major Greek powers along with Persia in an alliance against Sparta. And it was Persia who provided money to the Greek cities in revolt. And after all, it takes money to fight wars, and many of these cities were broke after the disastrous effects of the Peloponnesian War. Now, we also discussed the Spartans' critical naval setback at Cnidus. Although the battle is not well described, it was a huge setback for Sparta's hopes of maintaining control of the Greek Ionian cities. And once things were sufficiently stirred up on the Greek mainland, Sparta recalled Agesilaus back to Greece to address the Greek confederation allied against Sparta. After a long march, Agesilaus reached Boeotia. At some point, Agesilaus received word of Pisander's death and the Spartan naval disaster at Cnidus. Agesilaus decided to exercise a spin job here. He told his troops that although Pisander died, the Spartans won the naval battle at Cnidus. A nice little bit of propaganda. But why not? After all, his troops were somewhat demoralized after receiving some bad omens. It always seems the Greek generals were having to deal with bad omens. And since these bad omens tended to spook ancient soldiers, it was important to keep the morale as high as possible. Now, soon after Agesilaus entered Boeotia, a Greek army made up of mainly Boeotians and Argives decided to meet Agesilaus and his forces. Agesilaus commanded the Spartans on the right flank of the army, and right next to the Spartans were veterans of the 10,000, so these really were crack formations. Several of Sparta's allies occupied the center, and Sparta's latest ally, the Orchomenians, held the extreme left flank. The Thebans were on the opposite side of the Orchomenians, while the Argives would have to face off against the Spartans. Several Theban allies were in the center. Xenophon will tell us that both armies were dead silent in anticipation of the coming battle. As the two armies drew closer, the Thebans let loose some sort of war cry, and with that, the Thebans routed the Orchomenians in short order. On the other side of the battlefield, the Argives didn't even bother putting up a fight against the Spartans, and so the Argives just hightailed it back to Mount Helicon. I can just imagine the Argives yelling, "Get the heck out of here! Do we really want to take on the Spartans?" So without even a single spear thrust, the Spartans could claim victory over the Argives. Now this is where things start to border on the bizarre. The Spartans apparently believed they had won the battle, and started to, quote, crown Agesilaus with a wreath of victory. I guess they didn't even bother to inquire about what had happened to their left flank, but soon Agesilaus was informed that the Orchomenians had taken flight. So what's that old proverb? The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing? Well, in this case, it's the right hand that doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Now, to make matters worse, the Thebans were now plundering the Spartans' baggage train. The Thebans too were confused about what had happened to their left flank. Does anyone have any idea what is going on here? Well, eventually the Thebans finally realized that the Argives had not even bothered to fight the Spartans, and so the Thebans formed up and attempted to make it back to camp. Did they really think the Argives were going to keep their end of the bargain? Who knows, but the Thebans were not about to take on the Spartans mano a mano. Now, usually when an army is in retreat, the soon-to-be victorious army pursues and kills as many of the retreating enemy as they can. The pursuing army is more than happy to do just that. Pursue the enemy, not block the enemy in retreat. But Agesilaus, in a shocking move, decided to block the Theban line of retreat and launch an all-out frontal assault. Now, why would Agesilaus perform such a maneuver when he was sure to suffer more casualties by facing the Thebans head-on? I think this had to do with that Boeotian insult to Agesilaus a year earlier. And you will remember the Boeotians interrupted Agesilaus' sacrifice to the gods. And Agesilaus had not forgotten this tremendous affront, and so now he wanted his revenge. Now, it's always kind of a dangerous game to play when you disrespect an ancient Greek, but if you offend an ancient Spartan, then you got a war on your hands. It would be sort of like those Bugs Bunny cartoons when some of the characters throw matches into a room full of dynamite. You're just asking for it. So by launching a frontal assault, Agesilaus could be assured to kill many more Thebans than he could by letting them simply retreat. Not surprisingly, the Spartans and their allies wiped out the Thebans. The Spartans inflicted one of the worst slaughters in the history of Greek hoplite warfare, and so Agesilaus got his revenge, although Agesilaus himself was injured in battle. The next morning, the Spartans erected the traditional trophy of victory. The Thebans asked for permission to bury their dead, and a truce was made for this purpose. So what did all this mean? Well, I think it means what everyone knew then and now. that the Spartans could not be defeated in any type of conventional phalanx-on-phalanx battle. The Spartans were still the undisputed heavyweight champ of land warfare. After the victory, Agesilaus disbanded his army and returned to Sparta by sea. In 393 BC, the war resumed between all the major players. The Athenians, Boeotians, Argives, and the other allies decided to make Corinth the main base of operations. And so a lot of the action took place around Corinth, and that's why the name of the war bears the name of Corinth. Sparta and her allies set up their base at Sicyon, which you can see on the map right here. So a sort of stalemate ensued with neither side powerful enough to defeat the other side outright. The anti-Spartan confederation could not defeat the Spartans in a land battle, so they simply desired to bottle up the Spartans in the Peloponnesus. And Corinth made a perfect base to do just that, because the city controlled access to the isthmus. The plan seemed to be working, but the decision to make Corinth the main base of operations was hugely controversial in Corinth itself, for it was Corinth's lands that constituted the main theater of war, while as Xenophon states, quote, the rest of the allies reaped the fruits of their lands. The situation hit ahead 1 year later in 392 BC. One group desired peace, and another group desired to keep the war going. Not surprisingly, the peace group constituted mainly oligarchs, and the war party was made up of largely Democrats. Again, no surprise here, as almost every Greek city had this perpetual tension between oligarchs and Democrats. Now, the war party worried that the peace party was going to eventually win out, so they decided to do what every faction in ancient times likes to do to the other faction: off them. And the war party hatched an elaborate plan. They decided to wait for a special market day, when their intended victims would be at their most vulnerable. Because when you are in the market, you are thinking about other things, such as what type of wine to buy. And so when the sign was given, Xenophon states the members of the war party drew their daggers and attacked several men from a preordained list that had been carefully drawn up. It was a mass slaughter, and according to Xenophon, many of the members of the peace party were driven into outright exile. For if they remained in Corinth, their very lives were at risk. Eventually, some returned, although in a much reduced state of power. With their inability to restore Corinth back to a friendly footing with the Spartans, certain members of the party sought other alternatives. 2 members of the war party made their way to Sicyon and informed Praxedis, the Spartan commander on the spot, that they could show the Spartans an entrance to the long walls at Lechaeum, the main Corinthian port. Lechaeum was one of the greatest ports in antiquity. A paved road connected the marketplace of Corinth all the way to its harbor at Lechaeum. The road was protected by double walls, and along the way would have been numerous temples and shops. Lechaeum was a major mercantile port, but also served as Corinth's major naval base. Thucydides states that triremes were first built at this port in Greece. Lechaeum also greatly increased the wealth of Corinth. This was mainly through taxes levied on all the cargo ships that moved in and out of the port. So Praxedis decided to take up this offer presented by the 2 Corinthian exiles, and under the cover of darkness, they set out for Lechaeum. Praxedis took a small force of around 2,000 men. This consisted of some Spartan infantry and cavalry, as well as some Siconians and Corinthian exiles. Upon arriving at the gate, Praxedis decided to play it safe, and sent in a scout to ascertain the situation inside the walls. Soon after this, the Spartans entered the gate and passed the first wall, which was the western wall. But it became apparent the second wall, the eastern wall, was more heavily fortified. The Spartans immediately constructed a stockade and ditch in front of the second wall, and waited for more reinforcements to arrive. Xenophon states that during the night, no fighting took place, despite the brazen move by the Spartans. The next day, Argive troops arrived on the scene to relieve Lechaeum. Praxedis also faced a force from the city as well. The Spartans and their allies set up in battle formation. The allies launched an assault on the stockade, and the Argives initially succeeded in not only tearing down part of the wall, but also driving the Siconians all the way to the coastline. At this point, some Spartan cavalry rushed to the aid of their beleaguered allies. The Spartan cavalry dismounted from their horses and grabbed the Sicyon heavy shields and decided themselves to take on the hard-charging Argives. But in the end, the Spartans were killed nearly to the man. Despite this setback, the main Spartan force started to form up outside the stockade. This move was aimed at cutting off the Argives from the city. In a desperate move, the Argives attempted to make it back to the city, but were cut to pieces by the main Spartan force. Xenophon states that this apparently was made easier by the fact that the Argives were in a mass state of panic. A truce was arranged so that both sides could collect the dead. Praxedis now received reinforcements and decided to rip down a portion of the double walls at Lechaeum, which essentially made them useless as a defensive structure. After this, Praxedis conducted raids into Megara and also fortified Sicyon. Then Praxedis disbanded his army and headed back to Sparta. Now let's talk about what's going on at sea during this time period. We know from the last lecture, Conon and Pharnabazus guided the Persian fleet to victory over the Spartans at Cnidus. After this, Conon and Pharnabazus sailed on a whirlwind tour of the Aegean, taking city after city from the Spartans. Eventually, they arrived at the Isthmus of Corinth, where they delivered much-needed cash to the anti-Spartan confederation. After the money had been delivered, the fleet sailed back to Melos, which was the main Persian naval base. On the way home, though, Conon came up with an idea. He asked Pharnabazus if he could keep the fleet, and in return, Athens would fund the maintenance of the fleet. Also, Conon told Pharnabazus he wanted to fortify Piraeus, which of course was the great Athenian port. He told Pharnabazus if he was able to rebuild the long walls, that there would be, quote, no heavier blow to the Spartans, and would earn the Persians the, quote, eternal gratitude of the Athenians. Pharnabazus not only agreed, but he supplied Conon with all the necessary gold to restore the walls to their original grandeur. Conon could now afford to hire all of the crews and masons needed to start the rebuilding effort. This eventually led to the restoration of the Athenian Empire, and that became known as the Second Athenian Empire. Donald Kagan makes an interesting point here that I happen to agree with, that although the Athenians were able to rebuild their empire, it never really quite reached the glory days of the empire before the Peloponnesian War. Now, while the Athenians were rebuilding their empire, the Spartans, between 393 and 391 BC, attempted to rebuild at least some of their fleet after the disaster at Cnidus. And the Spartans achieved some success here. The Spartan navy was able to regain control of the Corinthian Gulf. Xenophon also states that during this time, the Spartans knew that Conon was up to no good. They knew that Conon was not only restoring the long walls of Athens, but also an Athenian fleet was based at Piraeus. Interestingly, around this time, there were some contacts between the great king and Sparta. Both sides talked peace, but in the end, the talks went nowhere, and the war continued on.